"He's not dead, he's trapped." The words echoed in the hollow silence of Erica's mind as she watched the 4 surgeons turn their backs on the man on the table. Dr. Sterling had already peeled off his latex gloves with a sharp, final snap, tossing them into the biohazard bin as if he were discarding Choi Tae-jin's very soul. "Time of death, 11:04 p.m., Sterling announced, his voice a cold, flat line that matched the monitor's monotonous drone. The other 3 specialists nodded in grim, rehearsed agreement, their broad shoulders blocking Erica's view of the patient as they began to shuffle toward the heavy double doors of the VIP suite. They were moving toward the lobby to deliver the news that would likely spark a bloodbath in the streets by dawn. But Erica didn't move. She stood anchored to the linoleum floor, her gloved hand trembling slightly as she stared at the high-resolution monitor. To the surgeons, the jagged, erratic stutter in the waveform was nothing more than post-mortem electrical interference, the dying gasps of a nervous system already gone. But Erica saw a pattern. It was a rhythmic, desperate signal, a frantic code being tapped out from deep within a paralyzed body. She stepped closer, the sterile scent of the room pressing against her as she leaned over Choi's muscular frame. His face was a mask of pale marble, his breathing long since replaced by the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. Then she saw it. Beneath the dark, intricate ink of the tiger tattoo sprawling across his pectoral muscle, the skin wasn't still. A microscopic, localized tremor no larger than a pinhead was rippling through the tissue. It was the signature. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew this sign. Years ago, in a rural clinic far from the sanitized hallways of Metro General, she had seen a victim of the blue ghost neurotoxin. It didn't kill the brain. It simply severed the connection between the mind and the muscles, locking the victim in a conscious tomb while the heart slowly forgot how to beat. "Dr. Sterling," she called out, her voice cracking the clinical silence. The surgeons stopped, their bodies half-turned toward the exit. Sterling looked back, his brow furrowed in a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Nurse Rivers, the case is closed. Let the orderlies handle the remains." "He's still in there," she insisted, her finger pointing at the minute twitch beneath the tiger's eye. "Look at the tattoo. The skin is swelling at the injection site. This isn't a stroke. It's a blockade." Sterling didn't even step back to the bed. He simply checked his watch, his expression hardening. "That is post-mortem spasm, Erica. Your exhaustion is showing. Step away from the body and go home. That is an order." As the heavy doors swung shut behind them, leaving her alone with the corpse and the cooling monitors, Erica realized the window was closing. She had 60 seconds before the toxin reached his brainstem and made the surgeon's mistake a reality. She reached into her scrub pocket, her fingers closing around a small, amber vial she wasn't supposed to have. The experts had walked out, but she was staying in. "Would you like me to write the next chapter, where Erica must perform the unsanctioned injection while hospital security tries to break down the door?" The morning light at Metro General always felt more like a searchlight than a sunrise, glaring off the polished linoleum floors and the pristine white coats of the morning shift. Erica Rivers moved through the ICU with the practiced, quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that in this building, being unheard was the only way to truly listen. At 32, she was often mistaken for a junior nurse by the rotating residents, despite having spent a decade in the most grueling wards the city had to offer. She didn't correct them. She simply watched, her sharp eyes cataloging the minute details that the top-tier staff routinely filtered out. To the surgeons at Metro General, a patient was often a collection of data points. A blood pressure reading, an electrolyte panel, an ultrasound image. But to Erica, a patient was a narrative, and every small shift in the room was a sentence. She noticed the way a patient's breathing changed rhythm 3 minutes before the monitors caught a drop in oxygen. She saw the slight tremor in a grandmother's hand that signaled a neurological issue the specialists had missed because they were too busy looking at the MRI. She was a master of the tiny detail, the invisible professional who kept the ward breathing while the doctors took the credit. This morning, the white coat wall was particularly thick. Erica stood at the edge of room 402, waiting for the surgical team to finish their rounds. Dr. Sterling, the head of neurosurgery, stood at the center of a semicircle of residents, his voice echoing with the absolute authority of a man who had never been told he was wrong. He was discussing a routine post-op recovery, his back turned to the actual human being lying in the bed. "The labs are stable," Sterling announced, tapping a tablet with his manicured finger. "Discharge by noon." Erica glanced at the patient, an elderly man named Mr. Henderson. He looked stable on paper, but she had noticed the way he was favoring his left side when he shifted, a subtle guarding of the abdomen that wasn't there at 4 a.m. She stepped forward, her blue scrubs a sharp contrast to the wall of white coats. "Dr. Sterling, excuse me," she said, her voice measured and calm. "Mr. Henderson's abdominal girth has increased by 2 centimeters since the start of the shift. He's also showing some guarding on palpation." The wall of white coats didn't part. It tightened. Sterling didn't even turn around. He merely paused his lecture, a flicker of irritation crossing his face as if a fly had buzzed too close to his ear. "Thank you, nurse," he said, the word dripping with a dismissive support staff tone. "The labs don't show any sign of internal bleeding. We'll stick to the discharge plan." One of the residents smirked, scribbling a note on his clipboard without looking up. They didn't see the sweat on Mr. Henderson's brow or the way his heart rate was creeping up by 5 beats every hour. They saw the white coat wall, the barrier of credentials that dictated whose observations mattered and whose were just anecdotal. Erica retreated to the nursing station, her jaw tight. She knew what was coming. Within 4 hours, Mr. Henderson would be in the OR for a ruptured hematoma that the labs hadn't caught yet. She would be the one to call the emergency code, she would be the one to prep him for surgery, and she would be the one to stay late to monitor his recovery. And when he was saved, Dr. Sterling would receive another commendation for his quick response to a sudden complication. This was the invisible life of Erica Rivers. She was the one who saw the patterns in the chaos, the one who caught the errors before they became tragedies, and the one who understood that in medicine, the loudest voice in the room was rarely the one with the most information. She lived in the silence between the doctor's pronouncements, a sharp mind trapped behind a wall of institutional arrogance. She didn't know yet that her ability to see the invisible would soon be the only thing standing between the city and a war, but as she checked the vitals on the next monitor, her focus was already sharpening. She was ready to see what the experts were trained to ignore. The quiet of the late afternoon shift at Metro General didn't just break. It shattered. It began with a distant, rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the floorboards before the sound of helicopter rotors actually reached the ears of the staff. Then came the sirens, not the usual singular wail of a city ambulance, but a discordant symphony of a dozen high-performance engines screaming in unison. Erica was at the nursing station, updating a chart, when the automatic sliding doors of the emergency bay were deactivated and pinned open by men who didn't wear hospital IDs. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized precision that had nothing to do with medical protocol. Black SUVs swerved into the ambulance lanes, tires screeching against the asphalt as men in tailored dark suits spilled out, forming a human corridor that stretched from the curb to the trauma elevators. They weren't shouting. They were communicating in low, urgent bursts into earpieces, their hands never far from the waistbands of their trousers. The hospital's regular security team, usually so assertive, found themselves physically moved aside, not with violence, but with the overwhelming weight of an organization that didn't recognize civilian boundaries. At the center of the storm was Choi Tae-jin. He arrived on a high-speed gurney, surrounded by a phalanx of his own men who were performing chest compressions with a desperate, frantic energy that bypassed all hospital safety standards. Choi looked less like a man and more like a fallen monument. Even unconscious and gray-faced, his presence was massive. One arm hung off the side of the bed, the thick, corded muscle covered in a sprawling masterpiece of ink. A tiger whose eyes seemed to glare even as its owners remained shut. The sheer scale of his frame barely fit the narrow gurney, and the deep, guttural shouts of his lieutenants filled the hallway, demanding a path to the VIP surgical suite. Erica watched from the shadow of the nursing station as the white coat wall finally met its match. The surgeons, usually the masters of this domain, looked small and uncertain as they were swept up in the wake of Choi's arrival. Dr. Sterling was there. His usual composure rattled as he was flanked by two men who looked capable of dismantling the building with their bare hands. The air in the ICU, normally sterile and controlled, was suddenly thick with the scent of expensive cologne, burnt rubber, and the metallic tang of unspoken violence. "Clear the floor!" A man with a jagged scar across his temple barked, his eyes scanning the nurses with a predatory intensity. "Nobody comes in. Nobody leaves. If he doesn't wake up, none of you go home." The lockdown was total. Within minutes, the hospital was an island. Armed guards stood at every stairwell and elevator bank, their presence a silent, heavy promise of what would happen if the medical team failed. Through the glass walls of the VIP suite, Erica could see the frantic activity as Choi was transferred to the heavy-duty monitors. The machines began their frantic chirping, struggling to make sense of a physiology that was rapidly crashing. While the other nurses huddled together, whispering in terrified tones about the Tiger of Soul and the rumors of the war his death would trigger, Erica felt a different kind of tension. She didn't look at the guns or the suits. She looked at Choi. She saw the way his fingers were curled into a rigid, unnatural claw. She saw the sweat that was too cold, too viscous for a standard cardiac event. And as the four top surgeons began their frantic high-tech dance around the bed, Erica felt that familiar, sharp prickle at the back of her neck. The underworld hadn't just collapsed into their ICU. It had brought a riddle that the men in white coats were already failing to solve. The VIP surgical suite became a theater of high-tech desperation, illuminated by the cold, shadowless glow of overhead LED arrays. Choi Tae-jin lay at the center of the frantic activity, his massive chest heaving rhythmically under the mechanical command of the ventilator. Around him, the four experts, Dr. Sterling, Dr. Ashford, Dr. Morrison, and Dr. Chattery, moved with a clinical, detached intensity that Erica had seen many times before. They were the dream team, a collection of credentials that had cost the hospital millions to assemble, and they were currently throwing every piece of 21st century medical technology at the Tiger of Soul. Dr. Sterling stood at the head of the bed, his brow furrowed as he reviewed the real-time feeds from the portable CT scanner that had been wheeled into the room. "I'm seeing a massive hemispheric shift," he muttered, his voice strained. "The intracranial pressure is off the charts. We need to burr hole him now just to relieve the swelling." Dr. Ashford, the cardiologist from Yale, shook his head as he pointed to the 12-lead EKG. "His heart is structurally sound, Sterling, but the rhythm is a mess. It's like the electrical signal is being hijacked. I've tried 3 different antiarrhythmics, and nothing is sticking." For the next 4 hours, the suite was a chaotic ballet of intervention and observation. They performed a bedside angiography, looking for the blockage they were certain was there. They ran a full metabolic panel every 30 minutes, searching for the biochemical footprint of a stroke. They even brought in a state-of-the-art EEG monitor, its fine wires glued to Choi's scalp like a silver crown, to measure the electrical activity of his brain. Erica stood back by the medication cart, her role reduced to that of an observer. She watched as the confidence in the room slowly bled out, replaced by a heavy, suffocating defeat. The white coat wall was no longer a barrier of arrogance. It had become a tomb. Each new test returned the same result: total neurological failure. The EEG was the final blow. The screen showed a series of flat, unmoving lines, the universal signature of a mind that had left the body. "There's nothing left," Dr. Morrison whispered, stepping back from the bed and wiping his forehead with the back of his gown. The brainstem reflexes are gone. No pupillary response, no cough, no drive to breathe on his own. He's brain dead. Dr. Chattery, usually the most optimistic of the group, looked at the floor. He's been down too long. Even if we could get the heart back to a normal sinus rhythm, there's no person left in there to save. It's over. The silence that followed was heavier than the hum of the machines. Dr. Sterling looked at the clock on the wall, then at the heavy glass doors where Choi's lieutenants were waiting like statues. He knew that the moment he stepped through those doors and spoke the words, the world outside would change forever. "Time of death," Sterling began, his voice cracking slightly before he regained his composure. "No, wait. We'll maintain the ventilator for another hour to be absolutely certain. But for the record, the patient is unsavable." Brain death confirmed at 11:04 p.m. The surgeons began to peel off their gloves, the snap of latex sounding like a series of small final gunshots. They moved toward the exit, their heads bowed, avoiding the eyes of the nursing staff. They had followed every protocol, used every machine, and checked every box. To them, the science was settled. The body was a machine that had broken beyond repair. As they walked away, leaving the remains to the ICU staff, Erica felt the air in the room turn cold. She looked at Choi, at the tiger tattoo that seemed to be losing its vibrant color as the blood pooled in his back. She looked at the EG monitor, still displaying its flat, mocking lines. But as she leaned in to perform the final post-mortem check, her eyes caught a movement, a microscopic, rhythmic twitch in the patient's right pupil that shouldn't have been possible. The surgeons were walking out, defeated by their own data, but Erica stood her ground. She saw a flicker in the dark that the experts were too blind to find. The heavy double doors of the VIP suite clicked shut, a sound that felt like a gavel striking a final sentence. Erica was left in the artificial twilight of the room, alone with the rhythmic, mechanical sigh of the ventilator and the man the world had already written off. To the four surgeons now walking toward the elevators, Choi Tae-jin was a clinical failure, a machine whose gears had ground to a permanent halt. But as Erica stepped back toward the bedside, the white coat wall gone, her focus narrowed until the rest of the hospital ceased to exist. She pulled her penlight from the pocket of her scrubs, her movements deliberate and quiet. The surgeons had checked his pupils and seen only the fixed and dilated void of brain death. But they had looked with the eyes of men who expected to see an end. Erica looked with the eyes of someone who knew that nature rarely makes a clean break. She gently lifted Choi's right eyelid and clicked the light on. At first, there was nothing, just the dark, glassy surface of a non-reactive eye. But Erica didn't pull the light away. She held it there, counting the seconds, watching the perimeter of the iris with an intensity that made her own vision blur. Then she saw it. It wasn't a contraction, but a microscopic, high-frequency vibration. A hippus, so fine it was almost a shimmer. It was a sign of a neurological system that was trying to react but was being chemically muffled. His brain wasn't dead. It was shouting through a silencer. Her breath hitched. She moved her gaze from his eyes down to the massive, sprawling tiger tattoo that dominated the left side of his chest. In the harsh, clinical light, the ink looked like a work of art, but Erica noticed a localized distortion. Right where the tiger's eye met the corded muscle of Choi's pectoral, the black ink had taken on a strange, bruised indigo hue. More importantly, the skin was slightly raised, a firm, pea-sized nodule that shouldn't have been there. She reached out, her gloved fingers tracing the edges of the swelling. The skin was abnormally cold, even compared to the rest of his cooling body. As she applied the slightest pressure, a tiny, crystal-clear bead of fluid seeped from a microscopic puncture wound hidden perfectly within a black line of the tattoo. It wasn't blood. It was an oil-based carrier. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't a stroke, and it wasn't a natural cardiac event. This was a signature poisoning, a rare, sophisticated neurotoxin often whispered about in the darker corners of international medicine. It worked by flooding the synaptic clefts, binding to the receptors so tightly that no electrical signal could pass through. It mimicked brain death by paralyzing every voluntary and involuntary reflex, including the drive to breathe, while leaving the higher functions of the brain trapped in a conscious, pitch-black tomb. The dream team had missed it because they were looking for a blockage in a vessel, not a blockade at the synapse. They had trusted their machines, which were only designed to read the absence of a signal, not the presence of a chemical wall. Erica looked back at the monitor. That stutter she had seen earlier wasn't interference. It was the final, desperate surge of Choi's adrenaline trying to break through the chemical chains. She looked at the clock. 11:08 p.m. The neurotoxin was designed to be fatal within the hour, but the oil-based carrier meant it was a slow-release variant. He had been locked in for nearly 50 minutes. She knew that in less than 10 minutes, the paralysis would reach the cardiac nerves themselves, and the brain death the surgeons had declared would become an undeniable reality. Erica felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She was the only person in the building who knew a murder was in progress. She was the only one who knew that the tiger of soul was still alive, screaming behind his own eyes, watching the world prepare his funeral. The surgeons had walked out, confident in their defeat, but Erica stood in the center of the storm, holding a truth that could either save a life or cost her everything. She knew what she had to do, and she knew she would have to do it alone. Erica stepped out of the VIP suite, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs that matched the ticking clock in her head. The hallway was a gauntlet of shadow and steel. Choi's men stood like statues of obsidian, their hands folded over their waistbands, their eyes tracking her with a predatory stillness that made the air feel heavy. At the far end of the corridor, near the elevators, the dream team was gathered in a tight circle, their white coats forming a literal wall of ivory. Dr. Sterling was at the center, adjusting his silk tie and rehearsing the somber expression he would wear when he told the men in suits that their leader was a ghost. Dr. Sterling! Erica's voice cut through the low hum of the hospital's ventilation system, sharper than she intended. The circle of surgeons didn't so much open as it pivoted, for pairs of eyes landing on her with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning irritation. Sterling sighed, a long, weary sound that signaled his patience was already at its limit. "Nurse Rivers," he said, not waiting for her to reach them. "We've already discussed the transition. The orderlies will be up in 20 minutes. Your job is to ensure the equipment is logged and the room is prepped for the next admission." "He isn't in admission yet, doctor, because he isn't dead," Erica said, stopping inches from the group. She didn't lower her voice. "I just performed a follow-up pupillary assessment. I found a persistent hippus response in the right eye, a high-frequency tremor that the initial exam missed because it wasn't held long enough to overcome the chemical blockade." Sterling's brow climbed toward his hairline. One of the residents behind him stifled a scoff. "A hippus response? Erica, the man has a flat EEG. The neurons aren't firing. There is no blockade, except for the total cessation of brain function." "It's not a stroke," Erica pressed, her words coming faster now, fueled by the image of the bruised ink on Choi's chest. "I found a localized injection site hidden in the tiger tattoo on his pectoral. There's a subcutaneous nodule with an oil-based carrier. He's been dosed with a presynaptic neurotoxin, something that mimics brain death by stopping the release of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction." She held out her hand, as if she could physically hand him the truth. "The brain is alive, doctor. The screaming. But the signals can't get to the muscles. The EEG is flat because the toxin has created a massive electrical interference at the scalp level. If we don't administer a broad-spectrum anticholinesterase agent in the next 10 minutes, the paralysis will reach the sinoatrial node. Then he will be dead." The silence that followed was suffocating. Dr. Sterling stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, his eyes cold and devoid of the colleague respect she had spent a decade trying to earn. He didn't look at the suite. He looked down at her. Do you have any idea how many millions of dollars of equipment just told us that man is gone? Sterling asked, his voice a low, dangerous silk. Do you think your intuition and a twitch in a tattoo outweigh a CT scan, an angiography, and a Yale-certified cardiology report? You are a nurse, Erica. Your role is to monitor the vitals we tell you to monitor and to maintain the environment we provide. You are not a toxicologist, and you are certainly not a neurosurgeon. The machines only see what they are programmed to see, Erica countered, her voice rising in desperation. They aren't looking for a murder. Please just look at the tattoo. 1 minute of your time. Enough! Sterling barked, the sound echoing off the sterile walls. You are bordering on a psychiatric break, Nurse Rivers. Perhaps the stress of this particular patient has compromised your judgment. I will not have you disturbing a corpse or, heaven forbid, suggesting to those men out there that we have committed malpractice. He stepped back, smoothing the front of his coat with a final, dismissive gesture. Consider this a direct clinical order. You will return to that room. You will disconnect the non-essential monitors. You will clean the patient and prepare the suite for a 12 a.m. admission. If I hear one more word about neurotoxins or hippus, I will personally see to it that your license is revoked before the sun comes up. The surgeons turned as one, the elevators chiming with a hollow, mocking tone. As they stepped inside, Sterling looked back at her one last time, his expression one of pure, unadulterated condescension. Clean the room, Erica. Try to be useful. The doors slid shut. Erica stood alone in the hallway, the weight of the white coat wall pressing down on her shoulders. Behind her, the guards shifted, their patience thinning. She looked at her hands, the hands that had seen the truth. She had an order to clean a room, but as she turned back toward the VIP suite, she knew she was the only person in the world who wasn't preparing a grave. The silence of the VIP suite was suddenly obliterated by the shrill, rhythmic scream of the asystole alarm. The monitors, which had been humming with a mechanical indifference, now flashed a violent, pulsing red, casting Erica's shadow in long, jagged strokes across Choi Tae-jin's pale form. On the primary screen, the EKG waveform didn't just stutter. It collapsed into a shivering, chaotic line before stretching out into a terrifying, flat horizon. The Tiger of Soul was no longer just a prisoner of a chemical blockade. His heart, starved of neurological instruction, was finally giving up. Erica glanced at the wall clock. 11:59 p.m. The Dream Team had long since vanished into the safety of their reputations, and the orderlies were likely already in the service elevator, coming to claim a man who was still fighting to exist. Outside the glass, the shadow of the guards shifted as they heard the change in the machine's pitch. She knew that in seconds the room would be flooded with people who would see only a failure of nature, not a crime of science. He's crashing, she whispered, her own breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. She didn't reach for the crash cart. She didn't reach for the defibrillator paddles. She knew that shocking a heart paralyzed by a synaptic blockade was like trying to jumpstart a car with no spark plugs. The electricity would move the muscle, but it wouldn't fix the silence. She looked at Choi's right eye one last time. Beneath the sterile glare of the surgical lights, the hippus, that tiny, frantic shimmer, was fading. The pupils were beginning to fix, truly this time, as the neurotoxin finally bridged the gap to the brainstem. This was the final 60 seconds. The window of life was narrowing to a sliver of light, and she was the only one standing in the dark. Every instinct honed over a decade of nursing screamed at her to follow the protocol. Call the code, wait for the doctors, and record the time. To do anything else was to commit professional suicide. But then she looked at the tiger tattoo on his chest, at the microscopic puncture wound she had discovered. To stay silent was to be an accomplice. "Stay with me, Tae-jin," she murmured, her voice steadying as she reached into the deep pocket of her scrubs. Her fingers closed around the amber vial and the preloaded syringe she had prepared in secret. It was a broad-spectrum anticholinesterase, a high-potency agent that would flood his system with the very chemicals the toxin was trying to suppress. It was unsanctioned, unprescribed, and in the eyes of the law it was an assault. The alarm grew louder, a piercing, unrelenting wail that seemed to vibrate in her very teeth. She could hear the heavy thud of footsteps in the hallway. The door handle rattled. The guards were no longer waiting. They were coming to see why the silence had been broken. Erica felt a strange, cold clarity wash over her. The white coat wall was gone. The ego of the surgeons was a mile away. There was only the needle, the man, and the truth. She wiped a small patch of skin near the injection site on his chest with a sterile swab, her hands moving with a precision that bypassed her fear. She knew that if she was wrong, she was a killer. If she was right, she was a ghost who had brought a king back from the underworld. The door burst open just as the needle pierced the skin. The click of the door's deadbolt was a small sound, but in the vacuum of the high-security wing, it rang out like a gunshot. Erica's hand stayed on the lock for a heartbeat, her palm pressed against the cold metal as she stared through the reinforced glass at the corridor. Outside, the world had begun to tilt. The two guards who had been standing like stone sentinels were suddenly in motion, their heads snapping toward the door as they realized the invisible nurse had just barricaded herself inside the room of a dead man. Inside, the asystole alarm was a physical weight, a jagged wall of sound that made every second feel like a minute. Erica turned back to the bed, her boots squeaking on the linoleum. She didn't look at the monitors anymore. She knew what they said. They were reporting a death that she was currently the only person in the world refusing to accept. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the amber vial of the broad-spectrum anticholinesterase. Her hands were steady, a strange, crystalline calm settling over her that only comes when there is no longer any choice left to make. She knew the pharmacology by heart. If she was right, this agent would act as a competitive inhibitor, flooding the synaptic clefts and prying the neurotoxin loose from the receptors. If she was wrong, she was injecting a potent chemical into a corpse, an act of desecration that would lead her straight to a prison cell. A heavy thud vibrated through the floor as the first guard threw his shoulder against the door. "Open the door, Rivers. Now!" The shout was muffled by the thick glass, but the fury in it was unmistakable. Erica ignored him. She snapped the top off the vial, the glass crunching under her thumb, and began to draw the clear liquid into the syringe. Her focus was so absolute that the room seemed to shrink until there was only the needle, the tiger tattoo, and the faint, disappearing shimmer in Choi Tae-jin's eye. Behind her, the standoff intensified. The dream team had returned, alerted by the security breach. Erica could see Dr. Sterling's face pressed against the glass, his features distorted by a mixture of shock and absolute rage. He was shouting, pointing at her, his lips moving in a frantic command that she didn't need to hear to understand. He was calling for the master key, for the police, for her head. "Erica, stop!" Dr. Sterling's voice finally pierced the barrier as he used a security megaphone. "You are committing a felony. Step away from the patient." The guard began to pound on the glass with the butt of his sidearm. Each strike sent a spiderweb of vibration through the suite, a rhythmic percussion that matched the frantic flatline on the monitor. Erica moved to the bed, her shadow falling across Choi's massive chest. She wiped the skin over the tiger's eye with a sterile pad, her eyes fixed on the microscopic puncture wound she had discovered earlier. "One shot, Tae-jin," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the alarm. "One shot to find your way back." She positioned the needle at a 30-degree angle, her finger finding the edge of the subcutaneous nodule where the poison sat. Outside, the glass was beginning to craze, white fractures blooming under the guard's relentless assault. She could see the security team preparing a heavy battering ram, their movements frantic as they realized the Tiger of Soul was being assaulted by a nurse in blue scrubs. Erica took a breath, held it, and pushed the needle home. She injected the antidote directly into the site of the original toxin, hoping to neutralize the reservoir before it could release any more of the blockade. The liquid disappeared into the tissue. Now came the hard part. She pulled the needle out and moved to the foreport in Choi's arm. She needed the rest of the agent to go systemic, and she needed it to happen before his heart forgot the rhythm of life forever. The door groaned, the frame beginning to buckle under the weight of the guard's ram. Sterling was screaming now, his professional composure completely shattered. He wasn't just worried about the patient. He was worried about the liability, the headlines, and the fact that a nurse was currently proving that his Ivy League certainty was a house of cards. Erica pushed the remaining 5 milliliters into the 4-line. She watched the clear fluid travel up the tube, a tiny, transparent messenger of life entering the corpse. "Come on," she hissed, her eyes darting to the monitor. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The flat line remained a mocking, horizontal desert. The glass door finally shattered, 1,000 crystal fragments spraying across the floor like diamonds in the sterile light. The guards burst in, their weapons drawn but lowered, followed by Sterling and the other surgeons. Erica didn't move. She stood by the bed, her hand resting on Choi's cold, tattooed shoulder, her gaze fixed on the screen. "Get her away from him," Sterling roared, his face purple with exertion. "Secure her. Now." The guards grabbed Erica's arms, wrenching her back from the bed. The syringe fell to the floor, echoing in the sudden silence as the asystole alarm continued its mournful wail. Sterling rushed to the bed, his hands frantically checking for a pulse that he had already declared didn't exist. "You've destroyed us, Erica," Sterling hissed, turning to look at her with pure hatred. "You've destroyed this hospital and yourself." And then, the alarm changed. It wasn't a flat line anymore. It was a single, sharp beep. Then another. On the monitor, a lone, jagged EKG spike climbed out of the basement of death, followed by another and then another. The rhythm was slow, hesitant, and profoundly weak, but it was there. The room went deathly silent. Sterling's hand froze on Choi's neck. The guard stopped pulling at Erica's arms. Everyone turned to the screen, watching as the impossible heartbeat began to carve its way back into reality. Erica felt the air rush back into her lungs, her legs suddenly feeling like water. She looked at Choi. The gray pallor was being replaced by a faint, ghostly flush of pink. She had done the unsanctioned. She had crossed the line. And as Choi Tae-jin's chest took its first, ragged, independent breath in nearly an hour, Erica knew the world she had lived in 10 minutes ago was gone forever. The rhythmic, mechanical chirp of the EKG was no longer a flat, mournful wail. It had become a heartbeat, tentative and thin, but undeniably alive. In the wreckage of the VIP suite, amidst the glitter of shattered glass and the heavy breathing of the security team, a suffocating silence fell. Dr. Sterling remained frozen by the bedside, his fingers still pressed against Choi Tae-jin's carotid artery. He looked at the monitor, his mouth slightly agape, as if the jagged green lines were a language he had suddenly forgotten how to read. The Yale-certified certainty that had defined his career was evaporating in the sterile air, replaced by a cold, prickling dread. Erica felt the grip of the guards on her arms loosen. They weren't looking at her anymore. They were staring at the man on the bed. The tiger of soul was no longer a corpse to be cleaned. He was a predator beginning to stir. Erica watched the monitor with a crystalline focus, her mind tracking the chemical war she had just accelerated inside Choi's veins. The anticholinesterase was flooding his system, prying the neurotoxin away from the receptors and allowing the floodgates of his nervous system to open once more. Inside Choi's body, the silence was breaking. For nearly an hour, he had been a prisoner in a pitch-black tomb, his mind screaming into a void that wouldn't listen. He had felt the coldness of the table, heard the surgeon's death sentence, and felt the sharp, unauthorized bite of Erica's needle. Now the blockade was crumbling. A surge of electrical fire began to ripple through his nerves, reaching for the muscles that had been turned to stone. "This is impossible," Dr. Morrison whispered from the doorway, his eyes fixed on the EEG screen. The flat lines were being replaced by a storm of high-frequency activity. The brainwaves, they're spiking. "He's not just stable, he's conscious." Sterling's face went from pale to a frantic, blotchy red. "No, it's a seizure," he barked, his voice cracking with desperation as he tried to claw back control of the narrative. "The nurse has injected him with an unmeasured dose of a stimulant. She's causing a massive neurological overload. Get the diazepam now." Sterling reached out, his hand moving toward the endotracheal tube in Choi's throat. He was going to sedate him, to bury the evidence of his own failure beneath another layer of chemical silence. He leaned over the bed, his pristine white coat brushing against the tiger tattoo that seemed to pulse with a new, dark energy. The moment Sterling's fingers touched the tape on Choi's face, the world shifted. Choi's hand, the one covered in the sprawling, muscular ink of the tiger, didn't just move. It snapped upward with a predatory, blurring speed that no one in the room was prepared for. The sound of his skin hitting Sterling's wrist was like a whip crack. The surgeon let out a sharp, choked yelp of pain as Choi's fingers, thick as iron bars, locked around his arm. The room erupted in a chaotic chorus of gasps and the metallic sliding of sidearms being unholstered, but no one dared to fire. Choi Tae-jin's eyes flew open. They weren't the glassy, non-reactive voids the surgeons had described. They were dark, piercing, and filled with a terrifying lucid fury. The hippus, that microscopic shimmer Erica had seen, was gone, replaced by a gaze that seemed to pin Sterling to the spot like a moth to a board. "Ugh, ah." Sterling gasped, his face turning a sickly gray as Choi's grip tightened. The surgeon's hand was turning purple, the circulation cut off by the sheer, raw strength of a man who had been dead 5 minutes ago. Choi's chest heaved, a ragged, guttural sound tearing through his throat as he fought against the ventilator. He didn't look at the doctors. He didn't look at his lieutenants. His gaze moved with slow, agonizing deliberation through the crowd of white coats until it landed on Erica. She stood at the back of the room, her hair disheveled and her arms still held loosely by the guards. For a heartbeat, the tiger of soul and the invisible nurse were the only two people in the building. In his eyes, she saw a profound, wordless acknowledgement, a recognition of the one person who had been brave enough to hear him when he was silent. "Nurse," a lieutenant whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and terror. He's awake." Choi's other hand moved, reaching up to the ventilator tube in his mouth. With a single violent motion, he ripped the plastic out, the alarm on the machine screaming a new, high-pitched warning. He didn't cough. He didn't gasp. He simply took a long, deep breath of the sterile ICU air, his chest expanding until the tiger on his skin seemed to roar. He looked back at Sterling, who was now trembling so violently his teeth were chattering. Choi leaned forward, the muscles in his neck cording with effort, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to come from the very bottom of the earth. "You," Choi whispered, his grip on Sterling's wrist never wavering. "You were going to let me stay in the dark." The lead surgeon couldn't speak. He could only stare into the eyes of the man he had declared brain-dead, a man who was now holding his career and his life in a fist of iron. Erica watched from the shadows, her hand resting on the medication cart. The white coat wall hadn't just been breached, it had been demolished. The hierarchy of Metro General had been rewritten in a single, violent second, and as Choi Tae-jin began to pull the shaking surgeon closer to his face, Erica knew that the silence of the last 17 years was officially over. The air in the VIP suite was thick, not just with the scent of ozone from the overworked monitors, but with a sudden, seismic shift in authority. Choi Tae-jin did not let go of Dr. Sterling's wrist. Instead, he pulled the surgeon closer, forcing the man to stumble against the bed rail. Sterling's breath came in panicked, shallow gasps, his eyes darting toward the security guards as if pleading for an intervention that would never come. The guards remained frozen. Their loyalty was not to the hospital's board or its prestigious surgeons, but to the man currently crushing the lead neurosurgeon's bones with a single hand. "For of you," Choi rasped, his voice sounding like dry earth shifting over stone. He didn't look at Sterling. His eyes swept the room, landing on Dr. Ashford, Dr. Morrison, and Dr. Chattery, who were huddled near the shattered glass door like children caught in a storm. "Four of the best. You looked at your screens. You looked at your charts. You told my family I was a ghost before my heart had even stopped beating." "Mr. Choi, please," Sterling managed to choke out, his face a mottled purple. The clinical indicators, the flat line on the EG, any medical professional would have reached the same conclusion. It was a secondary phenomenon. A mistake," Choi interrupted, his voice dropping to a predatory whisper. He finally released Sterling's wrist, but not before giving it a final, meaningful squeeze. The surgeon collapsed back into the arms of a resident, cradling his hand as if it were made of glass. Choi sat up further, the mechanical bed groaning under his weight. He reached up and tore the remaining adhesive sensors from his chest, indifferent to the sting. His gaze moved past the wall of white coats, past the trembling residents and the stunned security team, until it found the woman in the blue scrubs standing by the medication cart. Erica felt the weight of that gaze. It wasn't the heavy, dismissive pressure of the white coat wall she had lived behind for 10 years. It was something else, a recognition of life. "Min-ho," Choi said, calling to the man with the jagged scar who stood by the door. The lieutenant stepped forward immediately, bowing low. "The doctors told you I was brain dead. They were ready to move me to the basement." "They did, boss," Min-ho replied, his voice shaking with a dangerous edge. He looked at Sterling with a gaze that promised a very different kind of clinical trial. "They said there was no hope. They tried to remove the nurse when she spoke up." Choi turned his head slowly back to the surgeons. The monitors were finally stabilizing, the jagged green lines of his EKG now strong and rhythmic, a constant, mocking reminder of the expert's failure. "You have the best machines," Choi said, his dark eyes narrowing. "You have the best degrees. But you didn't have the eyes to see that I was screaming inside my own skin. You saw a corpse because it was easier than admitting you didn't know the answer." He pointed a thick, tattooed finger toward Erica. The room seemed to hold its breath. The woman in the blue scrubs. She was the only one who didn't walk out. She was the only one who looked at me. Not at a screen, but at me. Erica stepped forward, her heart still hammering against her ribs, but the fear was gone, replaced by a fierce, quiet vindication. She saw Dr. Sterling shrink into the shadows, his pristine white coat now wrinkled and stained with the sweat of his own terror. The dream team was silent. The credentials that had been used to silence her for a decade were now worthless in the presence of the man who shouldn't have been breathing. "She saved my life," Choi said, his voice gaining strength, echoing off the sterile walls. "Not with your machines, with her mind. She noticed what your $400,000 educations made you too arrogant to see." Min-ho stepped toward Erica, his predatory intensity replaced by a profound, somber respect. He bowed to her, not a polite nod, but a deep, formal acknowledgement of a debt that could never fully be repaid. "Nurse Rivers," he said, the name sounding official for the first time in her career. "The Choi organization does not forget its friends, and it does not forget those who treat our leader like a shadow." Choi looked at Dr. Sterling, who was still trembling by the medication cart. "You told her to clean the room," Choi rasped. "You told her to be useful." A low, guttural growl came from the guards at the door. Sterling looked like he wanted to vanish through the floorboards. From now on, Choi continued, his gaze returning to Erica with a startling intensity, this hospital will listen when she speaks. If she says a man is alive, he is alive. If she says you are wrong, you are wrong. He leaned back against the pillows, his breathing deep and regular, the tiger on his chest rising and falling with a renewed, vibrant power. The white coat wall hadn't just been breached. It had been dismantled and repurposed as a pedestal for the woman they had spent years trying to ignore. Get them out of here, Choi commanded, gesturing dismissively toward the surgeons. I don't want to see their degrees. I want the nurse. The surgeons retreated, their silence more deafening than any argument they could have mounted. As the door closed behind them, Erica was left in the room with the Tiger of Soul and his men. The clinical suspense that had gripped the suite for hours finally began to dissipate, replaced by the heavy, solemn weight of an acknowledged debt. Erica looked at Choi, and for the first time in her professional life, she wasn't just a gear in a machine or a background figure in a blue uniform. She was the woman who had seen the invisible, and as the monitors chirped their steady, living rhythm, she knew that her voice would never be silenced again. The transition began not with a grand ceremony, but with a quiet revision of the hospital's organizational chart that sent shockwaves through the administrative wing of Metro General. 2 weeks after the night that became known in hushed hallway whispers as the Lazarus shift, the white coat wall didn't just crack. It was systematically dismantled. Erica Rivers stood in the center of the newly renovated fourth-floor wing, no longer wearing the standard-issue blue scrubs of the ICU staff. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, a stethoscope still draped around her neck, a deliberate bridge between the world of clinical data and the world of human intuition. The Diagnostic Observation Unit was a department that had not existed in the hospital's 100-year history. It was funded entirely by an anonymous endowment from the Choi Foundation, with one non-negotiable condition. Erica Rivers was to have final say on any case involving unclear neurological or toxicological presentations. Her title was Cultural and Diagnostic Consultant, a role created to ensure that the tiny details were never again buried under the weight of prestigious resumes. Erica walked through the double doors of the new unit, her heels clicking with a steady, purposeful rhythm on the marble floors. She stopped at a large, interactive glass display where a group of senior residents and 2 attending physicians were huddled over a difficult case. As she approached, the conversation didn't stop or dismiss her. Instead, the white coat wall parted. The doctors stepped aside, their expressions a mixture of wary respect and genuine curiosity. Consultant Rivers, a young resident said, stepping back to give her a clear view of the monitors. We're looking at a suspected opioid overdose, but the naloxone isn't holding. The labs are consistent with respiratory depression, but something feels off. Erica didn't look at the labs first. She walked to the patient's bedside, a young woman who was pale and barely conscious. She didn't check the heart rate monitor. Instead, she gently lifted the woman's hand, looking at the fingernails, then leaned down to observe the way the patient's eyelids flickered in response to the overhead fluorescent hum. Look at the subungual beds, Erica said softly, her voice carrying an authority that required no shouting. There's a faint, cherry red tint, not the cyanotic blue of an overdose. And listen to the breath. It's not just shallow, it's sweet, almost like almonds. The resident frowned, leaning in. Cyanide? In a suburban ER admission. Not cyanide. Acetonitrile poisoning. Erica corrected, her eyes never leaving the patient. It's used in some cosmetic removers. It metabolizes slowly into cyanide in the body, which is why your initial treatments are failing. The tiny detail isn't in the blood gas. It's in the scent of the breath and the color of the nail beds. Cancel the Narcan drip. Start the thiosulfate protocol immediately. The doctors scrambled to follow the order, no longer questioning her intuition. They had learned that when Erica Rivers saw a shadow, there was a flame nearby. The fallout for the Dream Team had been swift and surgical. Dr. Sterling had been offered a research position in a remote faculty, his days of commanding the VIP suites over. The other surgeons remained, but they operated under a new, humbling reality. Their clinical proclamations were now subject to the Rivers Review. The hospital board, once terrified of the Mafia's wrath, had discovered that having the most accurate diagnostic unit in the country was a far better insurance policy than any legal team. On her way back to her office, Erica passed the VIP wing. The black SUVs and armed guards were gone, replaced by the standard hum of a busy metropolitan hospital. But at the entrance to the wing, a small, discreet plaque had been installed. It bore a single stylized image of a tiger's eye and an inscription in both English and Korean. For those who see the invisible. Inside her office, a single white orchid sat on her desk. There was no card, but Erica didn't need one. She knew the Tiger of Soul was back in his world. A world where silence was a weapon and observation was survival. She had saved his life, but he had given her something equally precious. A platform where her voice was finally a part of the harmony, rather than a discord to be silenced. She sat down and opened a folder containing the profiles of 3 new nursing students. They were from the city's most overlooked neighborhoods, women who had been told their backgrounds were a limitation rather than a foundation. Erica picked up her pen, a small smile playing on her lips. She wasn't just going to catch the details. She was going to teach a new generation how to look for them. The white coat wall was gone, replaced by a bridge. And as the sun set over the city, casting long golden shadows across the diagnostic monitors, Erica Rivers realized that the most important detail of all was that she was no longer alone in the dark.